This week on the Wheelhouse. Keeping kids safe. What it'll take to get the job done from Connecticut's new child advocate. For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is the Wheelhouse, the show that brings the politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond right here. Homeschooling was on the minds of lawmakers as the 2026 session came to a close this month. Lawmakers passed legislation marking what advocates are calling Connecticut's first meaningful rules around homeschooling ever. Supporters say the rules will keep better tabs on kids not enrolled in Connecticut schools following the recent deaths of some children. But opponents say the rules are an overreach and that the state should stay out of private family business. This hour, we hear about homeschooling and what the new rules mean for child advocacy. Joining us right now is the state's newly confirmed state child advocate, Christina Guillo. Thank you so much for coming on the program this morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So thankful for you to come on this morning. And folks, if you homeschool your kids or you want to have a comment either way on the new rules, hit us up, comment on our YouTube live stream, or give us a call, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. Christina, you were officially confirmed as child advocate earlier this month, but you've been in the role as acting in an acting capacity for 18 months now. So what does the child advocate do? Help us with that.
So the Office of the Child Advocate is an independent, nonpartisan state agency, and our role, in a nutshell, is oversight for all state-funded services for children. Sorry about that. And so what we do in large part is investigate our systems and our services to children. We try to identify where the gaps are and make recommendations for improvement. We also house the state's Child Fatality Review Panel. And in that role, we review all unexplained and unexpected deaths of children. And very often, we will look more in depth at children who've received state services. In particular, those are very frequently services from the Department of Children and Families. And we may issue reports where we find systemic issues that require some remediation.
Is there like a personal mission you have as you start into this new role here, or at least no longer being in an acting capacity?
Yeah. Well, in some ways there's not a big change between being the acting child advocate and the child advocate, right? We really focused on the work of the office when our former child advocate left. And my
good friend
role,
of ours, Sarah Egan. Yeah.
Sarah Egan, good friend of mine as well. And, we really had to... my role was to maintain the ship, right? Keep it moving forward and getting the work done. And during that time, we issued 7 reports on a variety of topics: autism, youth camps, conditions of confinement, education, and DCF. And so now, as I sort of formally enter the role, what we'll be focusing on. We still have our conditions of confinement work that we are required to do under statute. We'll continue doing that. We are going to focus heavily on the quality of care and treatment and the quality of the casework at DCF. And we really want to focus on our facility work, which means looking at the quality of care and treatment in the state's facilities that house children.
Can you talk a bit about your background? Were you associate child advocate beforehand? Could you just help me understand how you got to this point?
Yeah. Sure. So I became the associate child advocate in 22.
Yeah.
And so I was in that role when our child advocate left, and the statute provides that when there is a vacancy for the child advocate, the associate child advocate fills that position until a new child advocate is selected. And that process is done by an independent advisory committee that is appointed by members of the legislature, and then they provide a list of 3 candidates to the governor, and then the governor nominates one of those 3.
And then before that, kind of what led you to want to advocate for children like this?
Oh, well, I've been an attorney for, it'll be 30 years this year, and I went to law school because I wanted to represent children in foster care. And so this is what I've done my entire career. My internships in law school were focused on learning the system that serves kids, juvenile justice, child welfare. And that's really what I've done throughout my career. I've always represented children. I've represented children in juvenile justice cases, special education cases, disability discrimination, child welfare, and mental health. And so it's really very personal to me to do that work and to make sure that every child has a voice and every child has what they need to grow and thrive.
Reporters get to know you all from these reports that come out. You mentioned you already did one on autism. You did one on conditions of confinement. And we're going to talk about some of this DCF quality control assessment that you did. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So that initiates reporters to you all. And there are these real professional reports. So some folks could imagine that you'd be working in this huge office building in Hartford and you have this big staff. How big is the office?
So at the moment, we have 9 staff members and
9.
1 vacancy because as I've moved up from associate child advocate to child advocate, we've got that position open, which is actually is open right now. And during we just brought 2 people on.
I was going to say it was smaller even before that. Yeah.
So while we were doing those, 7 reports I mentioned, we had 7 staff members, and we are. We're very fortunate. We have an amazing team of people in our office with a diverse set of skills and lenses through which they look. And it really helps us take a critical look at the systems that we're working on.
Which is what I want to ask you about next, because they're going to replace you at some point as the associate child advocate, and then you did bring in the 2 additional staff. That expansion, how does that help you sort of expand your role here?
Yeah.
Expand what you all do, sorry.
Yeah. What it's really going to help us do is that facility work that I mentioned earlier. So we have a responsibility to periodically review all facilities in which children are housed, right? And we also have a specific statutory requirement that was added in, I believe, 2018, 2019, to look at the conditions of confinement for youth who are incarcerated. So that includes our kids that are in juvenile detention, youth who are housed as adults at Manson Youth Institution, and also our other adult facilities, because that goes to 21. And so with that responsibility, when that was added, we have 1 person who does our facility work. And so she was really dedicated for the last 5 or 6 years to that work on conditions of confinement. And we really weren't able to get out to the other facilities. So with this new position, the 2 new positions, we're able to do that. And we think that's critically important work. Children in our mental health facilities and other facilities where there's a need to look at the care and quality of care and treatment that they receive.
It's a huge job for 9 or 10 people. So break it down for us. What do you look at as like major buckets or priorities for how your office can work to ensure kids' safety?
Right. So I think the largest bucket of our work is really the review of the Department of Children and Families and the work that they do. And that work in particular in relation to child fatalities. That's sort of the largest chunk of the work we do. And the second largest chunk really is the facility work and looking at how we provide services to kids. We also do quite a lot of work in the education area, in particular special education, looking at restraint and seclusion and children with disabilities and how their needs are met.
With DCF, we're talking about reforms or changes. I've certainly had this conversation with Sarah Egan before as well when she was in the role. But now in this moment, what are the sort of systemic changes that could be made sort of in the short term, I guess?
Yeah. So I think there are a number of changes that can be made kind of immediately by the DCF executive leadership, right? And that really, it speaks to those changes would really be around being very, very clear about how they are measuring success and making those measurements really founded in the casework. Are they doing, the visits with children and families consistent with their policies? Are they contacting what we call collateral contacts, the school, the doctors, the mental health provider for the parents, the substance abuse provider for the parents? Are they doing that consistent with their policy? And is supervision happening consistent with policy? So we want them to use those as measures of success, and we want them to tie approvals of telework to those criteria to ensure that the job is getting done.
You're not sort of coming from the peanut gallery. There's some work that you did to address this and be able to have that kind of a conclusion. But I don't want to get there yet because I want to talk about that in the next segment. The other bucket, what can be another bucket that you guys look at? You talked about special education work. You talked about reviewing DCF. Do you all get involved in homeschooling policy?
So we do. We look at all policies related to children, and certainly our state policies related to homeschooling impact children, right? And every child has a right to an education. Every child has a right to be free from abuse and neglect. And the state has a constitutionally protected interest in making sure that its citizens are educated. And so we have looked at those policies and procedures to try to understand what the state's put in place to ensure that every child does, in fact, receive an education.
We have a comment from YouTube. Somebody asking about the rules about homeschooling in Connecticut. That's right. There was just new legislation put here into law in Connecticut. It hasn't been signed into law yet. I'll get to that in a second. But state lawmakers recently passed homeschooling regulations. Can you explain what this does in a nutshell?
Sure. So what that new law requires is, in essence, every parent to enroll their children in school or file a notice. So they file a notice. Basically, every parent files the same notice, and they tell the school whether they're enrolling in public school, enrolling in private school, or are going to do parent-guided learning. I believe that's how the term they're using for homeschooling.
Parent-managed learning or something
learning,
like that. And even that's the title of the law as well, or the bill that was passed.
Yes, I think that's the title that was settled on at the legislature. So everyone files that same paperwork every year to say how you're educating your child. And then beyond that, the most significant change is that if a parent is withdrawing a child from the public school system to move that child to be homeschooled, that at that point there would be essentially a DCF background check to determine, one, if there's a active investigation that's open, or if there is, if a caregiver or an adult in the home is on what's called the DCF Central Registry. And just so people understand, the DCF Central Registry is maintained by the department. People get put on that list under very limited circumstances. So that would be you've been substantiated as a perpetrator of child abuse, and the department has made a finding based on the chronicity and severity of those substantiations that the person poses a safety risk to children. And so what this law does essentially, it says if you are one of those people that's been on that list, then you will not be able to withdraw your child to homeschool.
888-720-9677 is the number to call if you'd like to talk to me on the Wheelhouse, 888-720-9677. You could also email wheelhouse@ctpublic.org if you don't get your comment in now. You could also go to YouTube as well. Your office, how were you all involved in the bill? I know you made some policy recommendations, at least in the past.
We have made policy recommendations in the past. And you testified? I testified in support of the bill. I made some suggestions for additions. They did not all get included, but that's okay. That's how the process works, right? Our office makes recommendations. The legislature decides what the policies ultimately are. And so we have been involved in this. Our office did an investigation in 2018 and issued recommendations at that time. And then we conducted a second investigation in 2025 and made recommendations based on that investigation. And what we looked at in that investigation was, first we wanted to understand how many children there were, and we wanted to understand their intersection with chronic absenteeism and also the Department of Children and Families. And so we asked the State Department of Education for data on children who were withdrawn. And we really narrowed in on a small group, 7 to 11-year-old children. And we looked at those 7 to 11-year-old children. And what we found is that when you looked at just 7 to 11-year-old children, 31% were chronically absent prior to being withdrawn for homeschooling. And that's really important because chronic absenteeism at that age in particular is an indicator of some concern. And once the parent, right, when a child is chronically absent, school districts have a host of requirements of things they're supposed to be doing to re-engage that child in school and get that child back to school. And the moment that notice of withdrawal is filed and the child is being withdrawn for the stated purpose of homeschooling, all of that follow-up ceases. And there is no further check on whether or not that child is receiving education. So we looked at that, and then we also looked at the DCF, sort of intersection with DCF. And what we found was that about 8 to 9% of the children who were withdrawn were in a home where there was at least one substantiated allegation of abuse or neglect, and a little under 4% had a caregiver on the child abuse registry that I mentioned earlier.
And in the new bill, if somebody is on that registry or there's that issue with chronic absence and you guys go ahead and look and you find somebody on the registry, you'd be able to say not so fast and be able to make sure that child wouldn't be pulled out of school.
Well, not quite.
Okay, get to that, yes.
So and just to be clear, the check would be, the school district would be doing that check through DCF, very similar to the way they do background checks for school employees. And there would just be a kickback of essentially a yes or no.
Yeah.
Yes, they can withdraw. No, they can't. And that would only be, again, if a caregiver or an adult in the home is on that child abuse registry or there's an open, active investigation happening. If the child is chronically absent, that's not going to prohibit that child from being withdrawn. And I think that's where, while this legislation is very important and it's the first meaningful legislation, it also does not go far enough to really ensure that children are receiving education and to ensure that they're safe.
Has the governor signed the bill yet?
The last I checked, it had not been signed yet. It looked like it had recently been transmitted to the governor. So we are very much hoping that will be signed.
When I talked to the governor's staff a couple of days ago, it hadn't been transmitted yet, so it must have just gotten there. So we'll look forward to whether or not that happens soon, whether or not the bill is signed. But it sounds like there isn't any indication that it wouldn't be signed.
Not that I'm aware of.
Homeschool advocates say the DCF check is basically a false accusation that the homeschool community is filled with abusers. In a recent op-ed, James R. Mason, I think it was in the Hartford Courant, the president of a group advocating on behalf of families with children who learn at home rather than at public school, he says that the new legislation is inconsistent with Connecticut's civil liberties tradition. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I think that it's really important to step back and think about the kids who don't have people advocating for them, right? And so, yes, there are a lot of parents who homeschool and do a really great job, right? Who have children going to college and having amazing careers. So that it isn't an issue of an assumption about homeschoolers. And even the background check is not an assumption about homeschoolers. It's a system to ensure that children are protected. Very similar to the way we background check every teacher and school employee. We don't do that because we assume they're bad people. We do that because we know we need a system to protect kids. And from my perspective and the perspective of the Office of the Child Advocate, that's what we're doing here. And we've had, right, we have these high-profile cases that we have not yet completed our investigations on and issued reports on. But we do have other examples, cases that we have done reports on, of children whose parents were on the child abuse registry when they withdrew their children from school. and their children were harmed. And that's not something that we can ignore. And system we have in place, and certainly the legislation that passed, doesn't interfere with the ability of people to homeschool their children. It just puts a check and some protection in for kids.
Christina's going to stick with us after a quick break. I want to follow up on this. We're going to continue to talk about this and get even further into the Department of Children and Families. Questions for her or any reaction to what you've heard thus far, give us a call, 888-720-9677. You can also leave a comment on our YouTube channel. You're listening to The Wheelhouse on Connecticut Public. I'm Frankie Graziano. This is The Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public. I'm Frankie Graziano. We're joined this hour by Connecticut's newly confirmed state child advocate. We just talked about homeschooling policy regulation, and now we'll talk about another way the state can serve children and their families. Christina Guillo is the child advocate for the state of Connecticut. I want to pivot now to the Department of Children and Families. 2 weeks ago, you released a letter of findings related to DCF and how the department was handling cases involving child safety. What did you find in this assessment?
So what we found, sort of in summary, is that the current quality of case practice, both in investigations and what we call in-home cases, is not sufficient to protect kids. There is a tremendous amount of work to do to ensure that workers are gathering the information that they need in order to make sound decisions. And what we're seeing, frankly, is alarming in terms of the lack of adherence to those foundational aspects of good casework, and they need to be urgently remedied by the department.
Following the release of the letter, DCF Commissioner Susan Hamilton said in the statement that her agency has commenced a multidisciplinary review at the agency. That review will include casework decisions, managerial oversight, and adherence to policy and best case practice standards, she says. Sort of what, I don't know if anything changes now as you move from acting to newly confirmed, but what's that relationship like? Like, are you already in touch with DCF in terms of your findings? And is there sort of, I don't know, just kind of give us a sense of whether or not you think those things will be remedied?
So we are in conversation with the department. Our office meets monthly with the DCF executive team, and we use those meetings to bring issues to their attention, to talk through problems that we see and make recommendations to them. And for some time now, those meetings have included some version of, we're concerned about the data and what it says about the quality of case practice, and we want to hear what you're doing to remedy those problems. And that's really why we issued this letter of findings, is that we have been having conversations for some time now. And I think there is a shared recognition that there are some concerns when we look at this data and what it tells us about the quality of case practice. There have been efforts to improve the casework, but they have not resulted in the kinds of change that we need to see. The trend is flat at best. And so we will continue to have those conversations directly with the department. I am hopeful that they will put into place some more significant changes. I do think that's what it's going to take. And look, this is hard work that the department does. It always has been, right? And I believe, and folks in our office believe, that the people that go to work at DCF are there because they want to help children and families. And it's really important that executive leadership, as well as the state, make sure that they have what they need to do the work. If they're not meeting expectations, we need to develop an understanding as to why, and we need to address that.
I'm in no position to make a judgment call either way, but does staffing with them as well have something to do with any of this? Is that something you've been concerned about in terms of whether or not they're actually able to do what they need to do to protect children because of staffing?
Yeah, it is. And I think more in terms of experience than in numbers. And so in 2022, there was a large set of retirements. So they lost a lot of that institutional knowledge. And they're currently having, and they have for a while now, they're having a high turnover rate. So about 50% of the people they hire leave within the first 2 years. So that means we have a lot of workers who don't have a lot of years experience. And we even have people at the supervisory level who have experience, but probably less experience than if you had looked at the supervision, 10, 15 years ago. And so that means that there needs to be strong training to supervisors, strong emphasis on what needs to happen in those supervision meetings to ensure that caseworkers have the direction they need. And let me explain what I mean by that. So in what we call the in-home cases, those are cases where there's been a finding that the child's been abused or neglected, and a decision that the child can remain safely at home with services, and they keep that child at home and provide services. In those cases, what DCF's data shows is that the quality of supervision was rated as a strength in less than 20% of the cases, meaning in less than 20% of the cases, the caseworker is receiving the information that the guidance they need from their supervisor to have timely direction on the case. That's an enormous problem. And that is something that can only be remedied by DCF, right? We can't pass a law that says you must supervise appropriately, right? That's not going to fix it. So that's really something that executive leadership at DCF needs to focus on. And I believe they will. I hope they will. And time will tell.
Your agency and state lawmakers are trying to get involved into this process to try to oversee what's happening with DCF. There was a DCF oversight bill, as I understand, that was passed this session?
That's correct. There was, it's 5004, was passed to create an oversight committee to be able to look at some of these issues with regard to quality, and with a focus on improving services and outcomes for children. And that bill did a few things. It requires DCF to create a data dashboard, which would give people sort of what we would call quantitative information. How many reports did they get? How many did they investigate? How many were substantiated? How many kids are in what kinds of placements? And that's really good. It's a very important piece of the puzzle, but it's not the whole puzzle.
Who's on this committee? Is it a legislative committee?
It is a legislative committee. It has many, many state agencies, and really any state agency that might have any connection to this work is on that committee. I believe we were made members, and then there are appointments that will need to be made, and that will include, people with lived experience, expertise in the area.
Just getting some comments from listeners. We got Cynthia from Glastonbury. I want to appreciate her sharing her perspective. Said her ex-husband was a truant officer and saw a lot of issues at home visits. She also has some experience, I understand, with her sister who homeschooled her kids in another state. She supports the new legislation and thinks it should be strengthened with more home visits, evaluations, and efforts to make sure homeschool children are keeping up. We haven't even talked about the curriculum piece, which is something that you all wanted in there.
We wanted an annual academic evaluation to ensure that the child was, in fact, making educational progress. And really, that's about, let's make sure they're receiving education, right? It's not as much about dictating specifics of curriculum, which I think is what people worry about. It's really about, our statute has subjects that are supposed to be taught. But it's very easy to withdraw your child from school, say you're going to homeschool, and then not provide any education. And that's just not acceptable. Kids need to have an education, and there should be a system to ensure that's actually happening.
And then we have another comment, as I understand it. This is going to be a phone call that we have, and I believe this comes from Carol from Bristol. You were on the Wheelhouse this morning, Carol. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you. What's your comment?
Okay, I am friends and familiar with a number of homeschooling families and their children, and I question what was said about they would have to file yearly how they are educating their children. Because as I understand it, and as these children have told me, as they take their exams in order to go to college, and they have to get their high school equivalent, or however that's done. I know they take exams in order to be classified at the grade level they're at. I know there's a lot of things that go on. So if the children are passing the exams, and you already know where all the homeschool children are, why do you need to have individual families file an educational requirement? It seems to me that's an open door for the state or counties, or no, we don't have counties here. Well, whatever, to kind of tell you what you have to teach.
Carol,
it's an open door.
Just really quickly, where do you fall at on this issue?
Where do I fall on it? Well,
are you supportive? Do you want regulation? Do you not want regulation? What do you think?
I am very supportive of non-abuse to children, but I don't think this particular portion of this whole thing applies to non-abusive children, because it's invading the family's rights. And as I said, I know a lot of homeschool families, not one or two, but a number of them, and their kids are one of the most wonderful children I have ever met. I raised 5 of my own, and these are good kids that have great education, and when they go to college, they're at the top of their class in their college classes.
Carol, thank you so much for sharing your perspective on the Wheelhouse. I appreciate you.
Thank you.
Have a great day. What did you think about what you heard from Carol?
Well, I think it's important to sort of be really clear about what the legislation actually does. So the requirement for this notice of intent for education, literally the parent is checking a box. I'm sending my child to public school, I'm sending my child to private school, or I'm going to do parent-managed learning. They're not being required to provide any specifics about what their curriculum is. And we talk about whether they should be, but that's not what the law requires. And, there are parents who are homeschooling their children who are having them participate in different kinds of exams. But that's not 100%. That is not across the board. And we know that because we know children who have been removed from school, for the stated purpose of homeschooling, who receive no education at all. And there is no check to make sure that that's happening.
Appreciate that perspective. Thank you so much for sharing that, Christina. What else do lawmakers need to do in the future to protect children here? What else does your office need to do to be there in support of the state's child protection infrastructure?
Yeah. I think the most important thing that we can do right now is really focus in on those, what we would call foundational aspects of case practice at DCF. Those policies that we talked a little bit about earlier are designed to ensure that DCF has all the information it needs, that the information is current and reliable and accurate, and that decisions are based on those on gathering all of the information. And without that, we really can't ensure that all children are safe. And so that's really where our focus is, and where we think that the focus of even the oversight committee needs to be.
I appreciate this very much. I appreciate the work that you are all doing. I've had a great relationship with Sarah Egan over the years, and I'm really excited to start this with you as well, Christina. And you are welcome on the Wheelhouse anytime you want to come on and talk about some business here. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to meet you and a pleasure to be here today.
Thank you so much for your work. Thank you for the topic today and coming into the Wheelhouse. After the break, we're going to hear from another person who was there this legislative session for the policy debates. Stay with us and call us up if you'd like to react. 888-720-9677. You're listening to The Wheelhouse on Connecticut Public. This is The Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. You just heard from newly confirmed state child advocate Christina Guillo about the ways the state is working to regulate homeschooling. Joining us now for further insight into the homeschooling policy debate in Connecticut is Teo Peck Suzuki. Teo is the Connecticut Mirror's education reporter. Teo, thank you so much for coming on the Wheelhouse.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm happy to have you on. I'm happy to talk education with you. Folks, really quick, if you have a call, 888-720-9677 or a YouTube comment. We're not going to try to cut you off, but we're just running out of time, so be quick when you talk to us here. New state child advocate Christina Guillo says that homeschooling regulation is one way the state can protect children. Why might child advocates sort of concern themselves with homeschooling?
Well, I think what we heard from proponents of the homeschooling legislation was they felt that homeschooling was sort of the one total blind spot as far as the state is concerned and as far as child welfare is concerned when it comes to addressing concerns of child abuse and neglect. I think we heard from Christina that, in a school, kids are surrounded by mandated reporters. When kids are being educated in the home, you don't have, the only people who are necessarily around them are their parents or whoever else happens to be involved, but the state has no way of knowing who that is. And so that perception of a blind spot, I think, was really one of the things that motivated proponents of the bill to pass the legislation.
Last segment, we had a caller from Bristol come in and asked about the legislation and also told us about some requirements in terms of passing of exams and things like that. But there is no current regulation really on the books in Connecticut.
I believe that is correct. I just double-checked that and in fact, HSLDA, which is a really well-known national homeschooling advocacy group, they were opposed to HB 5468, the homeschooling bill. According to them, assessments and stuff like that are not required. I don't believe there's any kind of curriculum requirements. That's the state of it.
Connecticut currently has some of the least restrictive homeschooling regulations in the country, according to your reporting, of course. A group that advocates for homeschooling policy regulations said that prior to the legislation, Connecticut was one of 12 states without meaningful homeschool regulation. Help me understand what the debate was like this year. Public hearing testimony, just kind of give us a sense of what was happening at the state capitol building throughout this whole process, or at the legislative office building.
Yeah, so I think even before the session started, when it was clear that homeschooling was going to be an issue, I think a lot of people predicted that it was going to get pretty contentious. That's sort of been the pattern nationally when these kinds of things happening, and that's certainly what we saw play out here in Connecticut. From the moment that the concept was raised very early in the committee process, you had Republicans signaling that there was going to be, a spirited debate about the topic. And then at pretty much every subsequent step, you had a number of homeschooling advocates, homeschooling parents, homeschooling kids arriving at the Capitol, sitting in on hearings. During the public comment hearing, many people signed up to speak. I think almost 300. And then there were a lot of pieces of written testimony that were submitted.
More of the families or more of these people that were against the legislation than for?
Very much so.
Okay.
Now, different people have different interpretations of what that means about broader public sentiment. Of course, people opposed to the bill point to that to say there was huge, public dissatisfaction with it. Proponents of the bill say most people who aren't involved in homeschooling are surprised that we don't already have regulations like this on the books.
Could you attribute that to I think we talked about this earlier. I think it would be sort of a lobbying effort that this sort of community or advocacy group has, where they're able to sort of get all of these people to testify. Can that be attributed to what's happening here?
Yeah, I think lobbying can mean a lot of different things. Certainly, they were very well organized.
That's what I was asking.
These weren't just lobbyists from various, nonprofits or what have you. You did have a lot of parents and a lot of kids showing up, right? But they were very, very good at mobilizing people to come in large numbers.
Christina Guillo earlier in the show addressed criticism from people advocating on behalf of homeschooling, saying the new legislation is an overreach that infringes upon civil liberties. She said that she thinks, hey, you still get to homeschool your children if you want to. Did anybody in the General Assembly sort of seize on that idea, that this overreach and the state liberties? Was anybody, any particular lawmaker sort of making that argument?
Yeah, we heard a lot of concern about that from Republican lawmakers. I think particularly during as I recall, during the Senate debate, there were a lot of concerns about some pretty fundamental rights that people have, that parents in particular have. You saw a little bit of overlap with some other conversations about parents' rights that we've heard in various other educational topics. But this idea that, parents have a sort of fundamental right to determine the education of their child, and that any kind of state intrusion into that is a violation of those rights, was certainly something we saw particularly from Republican legislators.
Very fascinating part of the conversation. We're establishing here that lawmakers and advocates think homeschooling regulation is really a part of the effort to improve the overall well-being of children in Connecticut. What else do lawmakers do this legislative session in Connecticut to help children? I guess I'm asking you, what else happened on the education front?
Lots of things. So the big one, I think, was education funding. This was
money.
Money, yes. This was something that lawmakers signaled very early on was sort of priority number one. We have seen certain costs for schools increasing drastically, health insurance and special education being two of them. And the way that Connecticut figures out how much money as a state to give to individual school districts has kind of been weighed down by this formula that hasn't been adjusted for inflation in a very, very long time. So all the inflation that we've experienced over the last several years, none of that has been factored into the sort of core formula that Connecticut uses to figure out how much money should we pay schools. So as a result, schools have a number of schools, particularly those that struggle to, pay costs through local property taxes, have been finding themselves cutting services. And it was very much a desire of legislators actually on both sides of the aisle to address that. And
Who are these towns? Are they alliance districts? Who's having the trouble in that regard that you just mentioned?
It's a lot of towns. Alliance districts, certainly. But, you also see pretty much any town that doesn't have the local property wealth, because that's how towns pay for schools, is you raise property taxes. If the property wealth isn't there, or indirectly, income isn't there, because obviously people pay property taxes with their income, then the town really doesn't have very many options as far as how to pay costs when costs rise. I mean, they can raise property taxes, but if your amount of taxable property, the value of your taxable property isn't particularly high relative to the number of students that you serve, which is the case, for example, in Hartford, then you are you just don't really have any options.
Back in February, we talked about how lawmakers also debated a plan to take cell phones out of the classroom, but that didn't pass, right?
It didn't. And, as a legislative reporter who is sort of in their first legislative session, I was a little surprised.
Yes, welcome to
by
Connecticut.
That. Yes, good to be here. The cell phone bill, unlike the homeschooling bill, did have bipartisan support. It was not unanimous support. There was some opposition, but it did have bipartisan support in the House. And then it just didn't get called in the Senate, which is what happens with bills. Not entirely clear exactly what happened, but it seems like senators just kind of ran out of time to address all the concerns in the room, and so never got called.
So the bill never got called. That means that local school districts remain in charge of what happens here, or not?
Yeah, more or less.
Okay.
So Connecticut does have a cell phone law on the books. The law basically specifies that schools should design policy in accordance with guidance from the State Department of Education. That guidance leaves room for them to have cell phones in place for, kind of instructional purposes. They sort of set the limits. You can have them in cafeterias. You can have them in the hallways. That's still the status quo for now, although Lamont has said that they're working on developing some clearer guidelines, because he certainly feels this is still the direction the state is moving in.
We had teachers come on the show, and they said that they were really in favor of this legislation and trying to keep kids focused. I don't know if I can ask you how everybody feels about it, but What was the sentiment like on this bill? Was there a lot of testimony in favor of this bill from, I guess, that perspective of the teachers, the administrators?
Yeah, so teachers absolutely very much in favor of it. Administrators somewhat mixed, and school boards were opposed. At least the Connecticut Association of Boards of Education, which represents those school boards, was opposed. Students also who were in schools that did not have bell-to-bell cell phone bans were opposed to it. I did speak with some of them. I've heard that students in schools that do have the bans in place feel a little bit better about it. You did see there be some disagreement, though, along those lines.
The idea of local control in school districts was one aspect of the resistance here. So is that sort of why this didn't, not necessarily why it didn't pass, but is that one part of it, or are there other parts to this local control aspect here?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. So I spoke with some folks over in Meriden, which does not have a bell-to-bell ban in place, and there was a feeling there among the administration and many students that there was value to giving kids access to their phones for instructional purposes. It was integrated into some classrooms, and then also that there was value in teaching kids how to manage the impulse to check your phone rather than just taking it away, that maybe by leaving it nearby, they, this would sort of train those better phone habits. Now, proponents of the bell-to-bell ban would say that the trade-off simply isn't worth it and that the cost of the distraction is far too great.
I know we just got to the end of the session. I know we're not in summer yet. Have you wrapped your mind around what might come up next year in January in the long session, or at least whether some of these bills that didn't get passed this year will resurface? Any initial thoughts on next year, Teo?
So cell phones is certainly on the menu, at least for now. Both Governor Lamont and also some legislators have signaled they want to bring it back. And the school funding question is, in the long run, not at all settled. The way that the General Assembly and the governor handled it this year, they did direct $200 million more towards schools, but they didn't actually change that formula that I mentioned earlier. What they did was way too complicated to explain here, but they didn't actually change that formula, and so that's something that they're going to have to come back and address. There's also a Blue Ribbon Commission that Lamont has created to investigate the question of state funding of public schools more generally. And that commission seems to have pretty broad reign to really interrogate how Connecticut approaches funding schools. So we could potentially, depending on what they come up with, see even more drastic changes proposed. But we'll have to wait until January to figure out what that is.
That's Teo Peck-Suzuki, an education reporter with the Connecticut Mirror. We're meeting for the first time, and I'm so happy to be working with Teo, and hope you'll come back on the Wheelhouse soon.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Couple of pieces of business before we go out here. Next week, we're going to be talking to lawmakers that are recently leaving their posts. We'll be talking about their job, their career, what comes next, and working across the aisle. Also, locally here in Connecticut, I'll be in New Hartford tonight talking about civic engagement with the youth. That's going to be at Brewery Legitimus. Take a look at that online in New Hartford. You've been listening to The Wheelhouse. Today's show was produced by Chloe Wynn, edited by Patrick Scale. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Thank you to Tess Terrible, Megan Fitzgerald, Isaac Moss, Bradley O'Connor, Megan Boone, and Sam Hockaday for their work. Download The Wheelhouse anytime on your favorite podcast app. I'm Frankie Graziano. This is The Wheelhouse. Thank you for listening.